I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker, Mr. Dr. Tony Pipa, who is joining us here from the Brookings Institution. He is a well-regarded expert in rural development, and he's also the host of a podcast, Reimagining Rural. Tony, thank you for coming to UVM.
So how's everyone this morning? All right. Another round for that great panel and the work actually going on at the Institutes for Rural Partnership. And Tricia, thanks to you and Emma Spett and Dr. Galamella, everyone here at the University of Vermont and the Leahy Institute for the invitation to be here today. Let me just give you a little background about myself, because I have to establish some sort of rural credibility, right? I'm going to talk about rural communities here. So just to give you a little history of how I got here. I grew up in a town, I'm a small town boy from Pennsylvania, north central Pennsylvania. I grew up in a town of about 2,000, and it really was an idyllic childhood. I mean, you know, we played in the cornfield right where our backyard ended. Went down to a stream where our dogs loved to just get wet, and so we had to towel them off pretty much every day. And then I spent the first half of my career in philanthropy. But I focused on community economic development, and especially where those issues intersected with race. I worked at a community foundation in North Carolina, and then ran the private foundation for a successful software entrepreneur. And we were often the first funder, actually, in remote communities across the state. And while I was there, we also participated in a national rural funders collaborative. And when I left that particular position, I then found myself down in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, helping launch a public foundation that was using private resources to enable economic recovery and especially in some of the bayous and some of the rural areas along the coast. But I went from there into the federal government. And when I was in the federal government, I worked on the international development side. I was the chief strategy officer at the U.S. Agency for International Development. I was also our special envoy to the UN to negotiate the Sustainable Development Goals. And I worked on our international development overseas really at the tail end of about 10 to 15 years worth of substantial change and modernization and just reforms that were really designed to increase the impact of our investments overseas. And international development, by its very nature, is place-based. So I view policy and resources from the perspective of place, from my personal experience, both as a funder and within my service in government. And I came to Brookings, and I'm a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development at Brookings. And I came to Brookings specifically to use that lens and that experience to examine how our policies and practices, as it relates to small and rural towns in the US, and to think about how effective that policy is, and how the lessons that I learned in philanthropy and in the federal government on the international development side might apply and give us a different way of thinking about that policy. So I'm going to start off a little wonky. I'll give you a sense of what our research is showing about the state of public policy as it relates to rural and small towns. I'm then going to shift to offer some reflections and stories from the podcast that Tricia mentioned. So this research is drawn from an initiative that I launched and I lead at Brookings called the Reimagining Rural Policy Initiative. So you can see all my writings and publications and even some of the things I'm going to show on the website there. And as she mentioned, the podcast is called Reimagine Rural. You can find it on any place that you listen to your podcast. This is the shameless promotion. Go to Spotify, Apple, wherever. Reimagine Rural, easy to find. and let's get started. So where I started with my research was just trying to map the federal resources available to rural communities for their local community economic development. And I always like to start here because it just kind of provides the context. So this is what I call the spaghetti chart. In the middle are all the development objectives that many of you are thinking about for rural places, whether it's economic development, whether it's better health outcomes, regenerative agriculture, broadband, all those kinds of things. Those development objectives are in the middle. On the left, are the federal agencies and offices where resources emanate from. And on the right is the authorizing legislation. So I'm going to keep this up here for a while and just give you a few takeaways about how I look at this. So first, when I look at this and when I talk to policymakers, from my perspective, the US doesn't really have a coherent rural policy per se. What we have is a lot of programs. And in fact, in 2020, when we mapped this, we found over 400 programs spread throughout every nook and cranny in the federal government. So we often think of USDA or USDA Rural Development as being the main agency for rural development in the US federal government. This actually shows that it goes everywhere. And in fact, USDA RD is just a portion of those resources that I just talked about. And this is an ecosystem that's really well intended. I mean, each program here represents a response by Congress and by policymakers to meet a defined need, something that they heard was necessary to be attended to. But the problem is it ends up being very fragmented and difficult to navigate, especially because the programs themselves are pretty narrowly defined. They all have their own application processes and definitions. We heard a little bit about rural definitions even from the panel. We were at a meeting yesterday and someone pointed out that USDA has 24 different definitions for programs even underneath their own oversight for what meets rural, just within one agency. And a lot of these have very similar objectives. So if you're looking to close the broadband gap, there are literally 90 programs within the federal government that might actually provide some resources. So how do you match up, what meets your needs? And how do you navigate all that? But behind all these programs, I actually think we lack a coherent strategy or policy vision. And what do I mean by that? Well, I don't feel like we have a shared theory of the case for how rural places are going to thrive in the 21st century in the kind of national and global economy that we have now. And in addition to that, I think there's little serious conception for how rural communities and their innovation and their economies relate to other parts of the US economy. So how does rural innovation be instrumental in helping our regions, our cities, and our nation succeed? I don't find that when I talk to policymakers that there's any kind of that coherent vision that's underlying all of this. And actually, I would say in Washington, D.C., we often find that rural policy is conflated with agricultural policy. Now, in Vermont, agriculture is really important, as it is in other rural areas. But agricultural policy is often about de-risking agriculture. And rural communities, and I'm sure this is similar here in Vermont, also depend on other economic generators like tourism and outdoor recreation, manufacturing, the shift to clean energy, the digital economy, small business creation. And rural communities are also seeking to address issues like childcare elder care, broadband, housing, Main Street revitalization. All of that goes far beyond sort of agricultural policy. And so we really need to get policymakers to see ag as part of rural development, but for rural development to be something that's much larger than that. So this was 2020. Subsequently, we experienced the passage of 3 major pieces of legislation, many of which, there's a lot of innovative place-based programs in that legislation. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. So we went through those bills with a fine-tooth comb, looking at it through a rural lens. And when I say a rural lens, we looked specifically at provisions where the programs were for rural only. No matter how rural is defined, like I said, there's a lot of different ways that the federal government defines rural, but if it was defined as rural, we counted it. We also looked at places where there were stipulations or preferences for rural, where a program might say, well, we want at least 10% of this program to serve rural places. And then we also looked at resources that we thought were really relevant to rural, because the money would either be disproportionately spent there or because the issue was disproportionately impacting rural. So an example of the latter would be broadband. The broadband gap in the United States is still disproportionately rural. Or an example of the former would be conservation money. It's not rural specific, but it's mostly going to be spent in rural. So when we looked through those 3 different categories and we put them together, and we looked only at the appropriations in the laws. There's a lot of authorization, and there's estimations on tax credits. We looked only on appropriations in the laws, where the laws themselves already set aside the money. We found $464 billion worth of opportunity for rural places in those 3 pieces of legislation. However, just $24 billion of that was specific to rural, so just about 2% of the overall appropriations, which means that rural is going to be vying with other jurisdictions to try to access some of those other opportunities. And because we like to make things more complicated, of the programs that we cataloged that fit all of that, there are 66 new programs. So we just added on a bunch of programs to that spaghetti chart that I showed before. But having said that, there's significant opportunity for investment in rural places. It depends on how implementation goes, but there's investment that's available. And it's not just investment available, but I think as we look at shifts that are happening socially and in the economy, we see lots of opportunity for rural. It goes beyond just resources. Much of the renewable energy economy is going to happen in rural places. Wind, solar, mineral mining, manufacturing. If you look at battery manufacturing, a lot of that's starting to come into rural places. Regenerative agriculture, focus on local food systems and sustainability of our food systems, that's going to be rural. There's a gap in digital jobs, but as we start to address the broadband gap, that's going to bring new digital opportunity. And there's even a chance that AI can be positive for rural if we think about it intentionally. Focus on bringing manufacturing back on shore, and you're seeing uptick in manufacturing in rural places across the country. Now, how will rural places take advantage of these opportunities? How widely the benefits are shared? And how well communities protect their assets and retain the value for their communities over time? That, I think, is the kind of the policy issues and the policy discourse that we really want to be having, especially because rural economies of the past have often been extractive and have created sort of a dependency on outside interests that's often proved detrimental over the long term, especially as value left communities rather than be sustained within communities. So I think the charge before us with these opportunities is to avoid that. And from my perspective, place-based development is at the heart of that. And what do I mean by that? I mean change that's really led by and owned by local people and local institutions who create the solutions that fit their place. Now, I want to be honest about the challenges of taking advantage of those opportunities. Tricia talked about some of the constraints and being sober about the difficulty and the hard work that it takes to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. You know, for rural municipalities, it's often volunteer elected officials. You often have thinly staffed city halls and have limited administrative capacity there, that especially when it's focused on sort of project development or thinking of what the future looks like. Many times the staff in rural communities are really focused on providing services, water, wastewater, public safety, EMT, those kinds of things. And rural places also kind of have a limited buffer of budget and contingency funds, can have smaller tax bases, and even disproportionately lower access to philanthropic resource. So just looking at the wonky part of this, we just definitely have some work to do at the national level to help rural communities navigate these opportunities. And I will say that there's been welcome evolutions even over the last couple of years to bring and strengthen the capacity and innovation in rural places. I would point to the Institutes for Rural Partnerships as a great example of that. USDA's support in helping launch those particular institutes and the capacity that they're able to do to both provide tools and bring capacity to rural places. You're seeing it reflected in new legislation. There's bipartisan legislation that's been proposed by Senators Fisher from Nebraska and Casey from Pennsylvania to create a rural partnership program that would actually make resources available to partnerships on the ground. And it's actually, happily, part of the Farm Bill conversation that's underway right now. But I could spend a lot of time talking about how we can improve things on the supply side for these resources. But what I want to do is move from talking about opportunities, the opportunities that exist for investment, the opportunities that exist economically, and to focus on where the action really happens, and that's in communities themselves. And as I mentioned, from my perspective, place-based development is at the heart of this, and the change being led by, owned by local people, local institutions who are creating the solutions to fit their place. And as we've done our research, we've identified a couple of elements that are really central to that success, and that's leadership and partnerships. And so it's really fitting that we're here talking about partnerships and innovation. And what I want to talk about is some dimensions that, as I've traveled around the country talking to people in their places that have been protagonists in positive change, share a few reflections and maybe even some questions to help you think about as you move through the next couple of days. And I have to say, a few weeks ago I was at a place-based policy gathering. We had a bunch of luminaries from the White House speaking and experts from around the country. And it was the first time I heard an economist acknowledge that his research were finding that there were a couple of unquantifiable ingredients important for successful development in rural places. And he said leadership and civic collaboration. And I almost jumped up and said, hallelujah. I'm not an economist, and I love my economist friends. I have a lot of them at Brookings. But it's not something I often hear economists admit, that, quantitative metrics are really important, and we need to think about those and learn from them and put the data together to build a case. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of intangible things that go into making a rural community work. So today I brought along a few friends from the podcast to provide a few reflections on partnerships for you to keep in mind. And just a word about the podcast. So I started the podcast on a whim. What I really wanted to do was to provide some concrete examples to policymakers of how change happens locally. And I could have gone out and done that the usual Brookings way and like done a 30-page case study on places and da-da-da-da, but I felt like, that's gonna land on some congressional staffer's desk and it's gonna get about 3 minutes worth of time, and they're working out every morning on the treadmill and they're listening to podcasts. And these guys are gonna be way better storytellers and say what's happening in their community than I'm gonna reflect that. And so, frankly, the national narrative around rural places is often one of gloom and doom. And I knew that there were places that were thriving. And I wanted to make sure that our policy was actually reflecting places that were seeing positive change. And as I've collected these stories, it's so evident that the communities that are taking advantage of the opportunities and adapting to the change that are happening outside of their communities really have partnership and innovation at their core. Sometimes it's across level of governance, so it could be towns collaborating together, or it's alignment, local, state, federal. Sometimes it's just across stakeholders or sectors within a community. It might be the university with a local business, or civil society, nonprofits, churches, faith-based alliances. Sometimes it's across regions and even rural areas connecting up with the smaller micropolitans in their area and kind of taking a regional approach. But what I brought with me here are the voices of local people talking about what's worked for them. And I'm going to start in Kansas, in Humboldt, Kansas. It's a town that describes itself as being in the middle of everywhere, 2 hours from Kansas City, 2 hours from Tulsa, 2 hours from Wichita, 2 hours from Springfield, Missouri. It's a town of about 1,800 that a decade ago had a downtown that was almost entirely boarded up. And it's now such a destination that in 2022, the New York Times put Humboldt on its list of 52 places to visit that year, alongside destinations such as Monaco, Vanuatu, and Marrakesh. Okay, what's going on here? So I figured I gotta go out and see how this happened. And so as I began to talk to local people, it became clear that it starts with a mindset. And so I'm gonna play a clip from Cole Herder, who's the town manager, and he grew up in Humboldt, and he describes sort of the beginnings of this.
I think we decided that nobody was going to save us. We had to, and this happened, clear back to 2007. Nobody's going to save us. We're going to have to do this on our own. And during that time, I think there was enough positive momentum that we kept doing the right thing.
So nobody's going to save us. We have to do this thing on our own. And the panel we just heard from talked about things happening outside rural communities, things like climate change and other things. And by and large, the protagonists that I talked to, what they are in control of is taking control of their reaction to those things and how their communities adapt to them. Like I said, it's not easy work, and we shouldn't sugarcoat it, but it is important to believe that it's possible. And since we're talking about partnerships, at the heart of Humboldt's regeneration has been a public-private partnership called A Bolder Humboldt. That bolder kind of gives you a sense of the mindset. And it's led by a small group of community-minded individuals, and they're backed by a local company called B&W Hitches, where a couple of farmers came up with a better way to use hitches on the back of their truck, and they're now kind of a leader in the industry in the US. And here's Beth Barlow. She's part of the family that started BMW Hitches. It was her father. But she's a member of Bolder Humboldt, and she's a manager of the company.
I think there's a tendency in small towns for us to settle for this is good enough. Let's slap a little paint on the front and open the doors. And that's just not really what we wanted to do. It's not really what we thought we wanted to be affiliated with. It's not what we deserve. I think that we often settle and we think we don't deserve for the place to actually look nice. It just needs to function. And gosh, if I open a candy store, I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be a destination. I want all the feels when I go in there. It's part of the experience of living somewhere else. And I always thought, why shouldn't we have that here? We should have that here.
So sometimes we feel like we don't deserve it, but we do deserve it. And Beth, I have to give her credit. She really got her hands dirty, and she created that candy store that she just mentioned. And I have to say, when you walk into it, and I lived in Paris. I had the privilege of living in Paris, France for a couple of years. When you walk into that candy store, you might be in the middle of Kansas, but you will feel like you're in Paris. And she lived overseas for a period of time before moving back home. And she really brought that sensibility back to her hometown. And so finally I met Paul Cloutier. He's on the town council. And there we met in the hitching post, which he called a modern honky-tonk. It was like decor from another century, and what he would say is the best collection of specialty whiskeys west of the Mississippi. It's got a little performance stage. It's kind of that third space where people can gather in town.
It's this region of Kansas Southeast that has, in many ways, has suffered a lot, has really struggled with infrastructure investment. It is a very rural place that has, for much of the country, has kind of been forgotten. And so because of that, it has meant there is the flip side of that, there is a lot of opportunity to improve things, to have an impact here. And that's really a big part of what's so attractive about it. We see it the other way around, which is build a town you want to live in, build a town you want to spend money in, build a town you want to stay in rather than leave to go spend money somewhere else, and you will start to see regeneration happening.
So I just love that. Build the town that you want to live in, and you will start to see regeneration happening. And that attitude that you sense from Paul and Beth and Cole, just really reflects a mindset that I often encounter in the partnerships that are creating positive momentum in their communities. They see their places as special, as worthy. They're willing to get their hands dirty. What's interesting about a Boulder Humboldt is they actually, when they started doing some of the renovations downtown and finding the investment for it, they couldn't get contractors to come from those areas 2 hours apart. So they learned it on their own. And he said, well, it's taken a little longer, but we've been able to kind of put together the groups locally that can help get this done. And it's interesting because it helped them also start with something small and practical and tangible. It was sort of one by one, not some grand economic vision all at once, but that tangibility and working on something small built the momentum and unified the community into that partnership, I think, in a really interesting, organic way. And it was interesting, in my conversation with Fall, he went so far as to suggest that it's cities that are the places that are not so special anymore. Like if you go to a larger city, especially because of downtown rents and things like that, there's a lot of sameness there. You find your Starbucks, you find, the big stores, the big chains, the typical downtown shopping development, while it's smaller places that have the opportunity to highlight what's different and distinctive about their place, why people feel so tied to that place or have some kinship, as if small towns are more artisanal in some way. And And these partnerships that I encounter really fit the scale of the aspirations and the ideas, and they're focused on what a community says it wants, not what it doesn't have. Just to finish this first point, we hear lots of talk about identity these days. But it's also, when we talk about it, we're often talking about personal identity. Who are we as a person? And I think the local leaders that I encounter, they really recognize that their communities have identities too. And their mindset is to leverage that community identity, what's unique about their communities, and to leverage that for thinking about how their future ought to be unique as well. So, question to keep in mind as you engage over these next couple of days: what's the mindset of your partnership? How is it focused on creating the place that you and the local people in those communities that you might want to serve, the place that they want to live in? And what's special or unique about that place or those places? And how do you build your partnership with that uniqueness in mind? So a second dimension to these partnerships is trust. And building trust often means meeting the community where they're at and being honest about what it's going to take. And that means, being sober sometimes about where the community is. And here's Andy Twigger. He's a native of Shamokin, Pennsylvania, actually a place where I went to elementary school, who's been a big part of a new civic business association that's been facilitating partnerships to reinvest in that town.
The timing of the revitalization projects and programs and the revitalization of the whole area, it's going to take a long time. We didn't arrive to where we're at now overnight. The decline of the area has been happening since the 1950s, 1960s, losing approximately 10% every 10 years of our population. So there's a lot of momentum there, and we see it in the mindset of folks who just kind of stream this constant negativity. Part of our charge through SABRE, through the business community, has been how do we reverse that? How do we reverse that thinking of like, oh, I'm just used to getting kicked, so I'm just waiting for the other boot to come swinging in.
Sorry. There we go.
It takes a lot of mindset readjustment to say, we've got a beautiful little town with a lot of little gems, and taking advantage of those and showcasing.
Oh, there we go. All right. Through the technical mishaps there. So Shamokin's a town of about 7,000 in northeast central Pennsylvania. As you can kind of hear in Andy's remarks, it's part of coal country, and it's been on a long, slow, steady decline. Since I went to elementary school there, it lost about 40% of its population. And what he's talking about is he's recognizing what people in Shamokin have been through, and he's not trying to talk them out of it, right? In fact, I think the team that's there in that town is really affirming what people have been through. And he recognizes that, as paradoxical as it sounds, even in a place that's experienced trauma like Shamokin, that change is hard for people to embrace. So he works alongside a woman called Kathy Vitovich. My mom coached Kathy in softball when she was young, and then they became teammates in the adult league. And she's part of a group that's reclaimed a bunch of mine land and used public resources to turn 8,000 acres into a conservation site. So this town is shifting from being kind of a tough lunch bucket, we power the country kind of town, to a tourist destination. And that's a real shift. And Kathy talks about how important the acknowledgement of history is to that shift.
I think that for any community to really maintain that community ethos, they have to understand their heritage and they have to understand their future. So you can't have one without the other. You can't have a future without your past. What we've done in all of our businesses is we've really integrated that heritage. The restaurant's name is Heritage. We've integrated that heritage, and throughout that business, that restaurant, we've incorporated different facets of the community's past. So we have old chandeliers from a theater, and we have different stock certificates from different companies, and the list goes on.
So acknowledging and affirming a country's or a community's history and the story it tells about itself is important to helping it envision its future. And I have to say, one of the things that's been really enlightening about the work through the podcast is how important narrative and a community's story really is to a community's future. I'm going to play a final clip from John Brown, who's the former mayor of Shamokin. He was a beat cop for 20 years. He missed public service. So once he retired, he ran for city council. He ended up becoming mayor. And here he's going to describe some of his first days on the job.
So we took office, and I say we because my wife was very involved with everything that I did. We took office, and first thing that a new mayor does is look to solve all the problems of town. We drove around countless nights, her alongside of me with a clipboard. I'd be talking about vacant properties, dilapidated properties, things that the codes office should be doing, assignments for the police department. My wife, on the other hand, drove around looking at people's houses and saying, my God, look at that. Well, I'd drive around the block and sit and look and say, which one? She's, this one. This is beautiful. Look at this house. Look what they've done with their porch. After a couple of nights of this, she got me looking at the good things in Shamokin. We decided then that rather than go to a council meeting and point out all the problems that we're working on, we're going to start taking portions of time and saying, look at Shamokin. Look at how great this is. There are far more beautiful properties than there are rundown properties. But we only ever talked about the rundown properties. That's all people thought that was here. So my wife started a campaign we'd go out and buy a truckload of flowers, just a small potted flower. She would write a little poem and attach it to it from the mayor and Mrs. Brown. The nice houses, we'd stop and take the time, just leave a potted plant. That was all. Didn't knock on the door, nothing. People would come home, find a potted plant, read the little message. And the response that we got was amazing. Other people started to believe that Shamokin was something. Groups of people, how do we get involved? Can we help you? The school, kids, the volume of interest that changed in making a positive attitude was absolutely amazing.
So you can see through the podcast that I get like a whole master class in organic leadership from people like Mayor Brown. And it's that mindset shift, again, that you heard from Paul and Beth, but it's also about helping that shift build trust in a different future. So the clips in Shamokin, I feel like, it's not just about partnerships, but it's how does the leadership in those partnerships connect in an authentic way to the community that they're a part of and seeking to serve, and put some trust and credibility into the future that they're trying to enable for that community as well, which leads to a second set of questions to consider as you go through these next couple of days. How do you ensure credibility and trust in the partnerships that you're creating? How are we meeting the community where it's at before leading it to a different future? And so my last theme is inclusion, and we heard a little bit on the panel about welcoming. And I have to say, some of the most innovative partnerships I've encountered have been some of the most welcoming. And they've really been intentional about including people who in the past have been left out or marginalized, either purposely or inadvertently. That can be people of different socioeconomic class, different races or ethnicities. And they've done this in a way to seek out ways to ensure the benefits are widely shared or sustained, but also to create not just a space at the table, but a space for leadership at the table. So here's Bryna Lipper. She's the president and CEO of the Humboldt Area Foundation in Humboldt County, California.
About 2 years ago, a group of folks formed the Climate and Community, or CORE, hub of the Redwood region. That group of people was myself, based here at a community foundation, one of our county supervisors in Humboldt, our energy research center at the Cal Poly University here, a tribal climate leader, and began to think about the energy vulnerability here that we were experiencing with wildfires and Pacific gas and electric, PG&E, power shutoffs because of fire risk. And also just the severity of climate change and the impacts in the region. We are some of the fastest rates of sea level rise here in this entire country due to subsidence effects. And we thought that if we could figure out a different way of approaching climate change, industrial development, self-empowerment, and do that in a way that assured tribal voices in particular, with their expertise around environment and ecosystems, had a strong voice at the table to describe what it was that they wanted, what they envisioned, and had the space to talk about risks and trade-offs and opportunities.
So Humboldt County is on the verge of major offshore wind development. I mean, we're talking wind turbines the size of the Eiffel Tower that could go in about 20 miles off the coast, and it could generate enough electricity to power up to 15 to 20% of the state's electricity, and we're talking about like the 5th largest economy in the world right now. But Humboldt's really experienced a lot of rushes in its past: the gold rush, timber rush, even the cannabis rush, and none of them really fulfilled their promise and even were hurtful for some of the folks that live there, especially the federally registered tribes. And the core hub that Bryna describes is putting tribal leaders not only at the table, but they are actually leading that particular hub. And they're thinking about what could a collective agreement be with the global companies that are developing the offshore wind to ensure that there's community benefits that are really widely shared. So it's this shift from community engagement to community leadership. And Tricia even talked about in rural Vermont, the welcoming aspects of some communities with the refugee communities and newcomers coming in. Alex Beck, who from Brattleboro, Vermont, was also part of the podcast, talking about the work that they had done in Brattleboro. And interestingly, the partnerships that worked for them there were about the faith community as well as local businesses that really created the space to help those families integrate. And the businesses who appreciated that these newcomers were seeking new opportunity as well in helping economically power the town. So I think there's a final question to ask, which is who else needs to be at the table for your partnerships to have as much impact as possible and to ensure that the benefits are widely shared? How can we make sure we're being not only as welcoming as possible in those partnerships, but also creating the space for their leadership in these partnerships? So there's 3 questions there. What's the mindset of your partnership? How is it focused on the assets that are special and distinctive about the communities you're seeking to serve? How do we incorporate that to its best advantage? What do we need to build the trust and credibility necessary for our partnership to look to the future and succeed with that new future? And who else needs to be at the table? And how do we create leadership for that? So I'm going to play a final clip, but before I do, I'm just going to point out that there's mics. There's 3 different mics in the audience. We're going to have a little bit of time for questions and comments. So you can start lining up now. But let me just come let me end by coming back to the national narrative around rural again. That narrative around gloom and doom often makes it sound as if people feel trapped or are trapped in their rural places. And my experience is to the contrary. People are often rural by choice. And the national narrative is also that rural is a victim. But again, my experience is that rural places have a great deal of agency, which you've just heard from the people here throughout. And I think it's apparent from these clips that we need to reimagine not just our policy and our partnerships, but also our narrative. So for this final clip, I'm going to go out to Eagle Butte, South Dakota, and the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation. I think one of the most underappreciated things about the rural United States is just how diverse it is, racially, geographically, economically, and I hope that that comes through in the podcast. And this is Cheryl Dupree. She's still in her 30s, but she turned a food truck business selling lumpia at local powwows, lumpia are these Filipino egg rolls, into a steakhouse. And she's a rancher that now anchors downtown Eagle Butte. And she just loves living in her rural place.
So I'm really lucky. I'm very fortunate to have the support group that I have. And so I'll go feed with my dad. My son will go feed. Everyone just kind of pitches in. And it's kind of how it has to work around here because everything, it's just us. It's a rural community. It's literally your cousins, your friends, your uncles, and kids, everybody you've grown up with just trying to pitch in to make it all work, I suppose. One of my favorite quotes I kind of live by is, be humble on the mountaintops, be steadfast in the valley, and be faithful in between. And I think that everyone could use a little reminder that be humble, be quick on your feet, but just keep going.
Be humble, be quick on your feet, but just keep going. So I think that's a wonderful piece of wisdom to leave you with as you enter into these next 2 days, to learn, to provoke your thinking, and to form new partnerships to keep Vermont special, vital, and vibrant, to build the town and the towns that you want to live in. Thanks for having me, and thanks for welcoming these other visitors along with me from the podcast that I brought with me today. And like I said, we have a little bit of time for questions, comments, if people are so choose. Any takers? I killed the room? Really?
Sculpted around those definitions. And unless we are clever with the definitions we use, we're not going to get legislation that fits the needs of our particular state and local economy. And I think that point was in your materials as well. But
yes,
it's so important that the definition issues don't just be written off as an academic or philosophical initiative, but that they're critical to getting legislation that addresses the needs of your community in your state, because every goddamn state in this country has slightly different criteria. So by the time the programs sift out to a rural area, unless you've got a clear definition of what your jurisdiction is, you're not going to get funded.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And for those who are online and didn't hear the beginning of that, we were just talking about the importance of the definitions and how they really shape policy and the effects that they have on how resources get distributed. And I have to say, one thing to keep in mind about all those definitions, especially the quantitative definitions of rural, is that they really aren't about rural, they're about what's not urban, right? So they're either non-metro from the Office of Management and Budgets, metro, non-metro, or the Census Bureau's urbanized areas. It becomes the things that aren't urbanized that then default to rural. And so having a better sense of proactively what we mean by rural, and I think we even heard about that from the panel, there's both quantitative aspects to that, but there's also perceptions, people thinking of themselves as rural or communities thinking of themselves as rural as well. But the fact that definitions really drive programs is definitely the case, and something that we're trying to work really hard to at least streamline. I don't think it will ever be, there's just going to be one definition, but I think streamlining it so that a community doesn't fall into 33% of the programs that are termed rural and doesn't fall into 66% of them.
That may be continuing or not continuing to come to rural communities after this boost that we've seen?
Yeah, so two-part question there. What are we seeing about the extent to which those resources get to rural communities? And then two, what's the forecast for whether they continue to be able to be available? I'll take a little bit of the latter first. There are definitely some resources being made available now that are surge resources, broadband being one of them. We're not going to see the level of investment again that we're seeing in broadband, so it's really incumbent upon us to get broadband right through this major investment. And just a note about that is broadband funding, even though it's coming from the federal government through the new program that they set up through the bipartisan infrastructure law, is actually being deployed and distributed with final decisions being made by the state. So that is something to be in conversation with your state about. And water, wastewater, loan funds, for example, are similar. It's the state governments that really have the final jurisdiction over those resources. Others were just refunding of or little plus-ups of existing programs. And so I do think you will continue to see some of that flow over time continue. Some of them are programs, especially if the programs are seeing to produce results and produce outcomes. Sidebar, one of my great frustrations on the wonkish side is how little data we actually have about what's working well. And that's where the university and the Institutes for Partnership can be really helpful. We aren't collecting great data, especially coming from international development experience where we set aside 5% of our funding at USAID to mandate third-party evaluations and have a sense of what the impact is of the investments that we're making. We don't do that anything near the level of these domestic funds. But there will be ongoing funding. And I will say, when my initial report came out in 2020, it kind of landed with a thud. I didn't get much love from the Hill. I didn't get much love from the executive branch. Last 24 months, I am busier than my head can spin. Everybody is very interested, and even the bipartisan legislation that I mentioned focused on rural capacity building is a real innovation and a huge step forward. Whether or not it becomes law, that's another question, but even the fact that it's on the table in a bipartisan way, and it's in both the chair of the Senate Agricultural Committee and the ranking member, their frameworks for the Farm Bill, that's a huge step forward. And so I do think that you're seeing a policy-making focus. You're also seeing it in the executive branch. President Biden, on his first day in office, signed an executive order on equity. We often focus on the racial equity part of that, but it actually also calls out underserved communities and specifically focuses on rural in that executive director. And so that's a directive to the executive branch that their programs need to be reaching rural. That's kind of momentum that we want to keep going. And if I have anything to do about it, we'll try to keep that going. Having said that, there's not a lot of us in Washington, D.C. at think tanks thinking about rural community economic development, so we need to enlarge that space, and that's partnerships as well.
Thank you for being here and for raising broadband so many times in this conversation. And equity too, because in addition to the grants that the states are receiving, there's also a federal competitive grant for digital equity that organizations around Vermont are actually trying to build a coalition on right now. And one of the interesting things about Vermont through the pandemic was that so many people from urban areas moved to our rural communities that were in the midst of aging. And we're still in that transition.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a digital equity divide. So many people who have not had exposure because of lack of access, but we also have a lack of skills or access to appropriate devices, complemented by this influx of people for whom that's all so normal.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can speak to that change. And our aging population, if we had more seniors who had skill sets and devices and affordable access, they could help us fill some of our jobs. I wonder if you've had a chance to see any data in other states about that exodus from urban areas and the impact on rural and the role of broadband in creating more connections.
So the 2020 census was the first time nationally that we actually lost rural population. But since then, there's been an uptick in rural population. And I do think it is to people moving to new places. The pandemic, started that. They're not necessarily moving to remote rural places. They tend to be moving to rural places that are within shouting distance of either micropolitans or metropolitans. But it is bringing new challenges as well as opportunities. It is bringing some increased momentum for broadband, because I think towns, both that's a pressure from them because they're used to having access to that, and they need it if they want to be able to work remotely, for example. But also towns wanting to attract that sort of community as well want to make sure that they're addressing the broadband gap. But it's also brought challenges like housing, and it's really, I actually think one of the most underreported national stories right now is the housing crisis in rural places, with housing that's much older stock, hasn't been a lot of new housing in a while, and real estate prices are really out of reach, which is putting pressure on young people again, wanting to stay in their place and have opportunity in their place. I don't know the extent to which, remote work is going to be kind of the saving grace for rural places, but I think it's created a lot of policy momentum around some of these particular issues that's brought those issues to the fore, which I'm really grateful for. And I think it's brought it not just at the national level, but like you say, at the state level as well. And even at the regional level, even at the smaller regional level, because places see what they can make available in terms of opportunity. And I will also say, to your point about workforce, certainly Vermont is one of the poster children for labor shortages and how that shortage is actually threatening the economic underpinnings of rural places. I think being able to offer the opportunity to more seniors to be part of that is great, but I also think that that's also going to be a question around welcoming new residents and newcomers, and who those newcomers might be. Those newcomers might be, urbanites, but they also might be in migration or even immigrants from new places as well. And I think being thoughtful and intentional about integrating them into the community and being welcoming, like we were talking about, is actually going to be really important. Oh, yes. Yeah, and so the American, yes, the program on digital equity that has lapsed, but that we hope will come back, I think is going to be really important. One thing about broadband is deployment is only the first step. It's also affordability and adoption that actually make the broadband useful in communities. And so making sure we have the federal policy for that is really important. I think we have time for one last question or comment.
Just to piggyback on the last question. These urban exiles who come here, earn a lot more money than most Vermonters. It's creating an economic divide. You can work in Vermont, you can live in Vermont and work almost anywhere. And so you earn Google salaries. Whereas the people who take care of you and teach your children earn rural salaries. And that's a real problem we have. Any thoughts?
So the communities that have leveraged that well have sought to make those people feel a kinship to those new communities and gotten them involved. And being able to use both their resources, but also their social capital and even political capital sometimes to ensure the quality of life in those places stay high. One thing that I didn't really emphasize that was kind of a theme throughout even those clips is that, again, it wasn't grand economic strategies that many communities take on. They actually start by focusing on quality of life and pride of place. And getting newcomers who are making those salaries and seeking to take advantage of that place, making them feel part of that community and even asking them to be part of the leadership of that community, and then asking them to invest in that community. Those are what communities that have leveraged that well that I've seen happen. Now, it's not easy to do. Many times it's more organic than planned, but they've actually been able to take advantage in that particular way. So I'm at time. You have been a very patient and generous audience, and onward to the hard work ahead. Thanks very much for having me.